Welcome. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for the second part of our series of insight-driven webinars, social sharing in B2B, measurement best practice. So for those of you who perhaps were able to join the first one, we talked about the foundations of social measurement, and today we'll be spending the next 45 minutes going through some of the best practice indicators for both online and offline social measurement. So just a couple of housekeeping things. So firstly, I'm Vivienne. I'm the global head of Cognito's digital and social media practice. We've got a great group of experts with us to talk us through different areas of social measurement today. A few things. So we will be recording this webinar, so it will be available afterwards, as will the accompanying slides that go along with it. So for some of the people who weren't able to make it, or if you wanted to share with your colleagues, you're very welcome to, and it will be available afterwards. Could I ask everyone to put their phones on mute, please, and to also put their mobile phones or cell phones on silence? And if you have any questions, please use the chat function, which is part of the technology, the ReadyTalk technology, which you're currently logged on to as well. We'll be looking to run the webinar for about 45 minutes to leave about 10-15 minutes for questions at the end. So please do keep your questions coming in, and we will get to them as best as we can. But we will absolutely finish on time before 5 p.m. So we really are going to safeguard that hour that we have with you. So without further ado, let me just do a quick introduction to our great group of experts. So some of you may already be familiar with Steve Thomson. He's the UK MD of Keller and Engagement Labs, and he was a great expert who was also part of the first series of webinars that we did about 6 weeks ago. Secondly, we've got Vivienne Pino, who's joining us all the way from Toronto. And she's the Vice President of Analytics and Insights at Engagement Labs. And we're delighted to have her talk us through some of her key expertise today as well. And certainly, last but not least, is our very own Katie Kinnear, who is the Social Media Manager at Cognito. So I'll just do a little bit of a introduction, which is going to cover some of what the webinar is going to be about today, but also a little bit of a recap of kind of what's got us to this point today, as well as overgoing some of the areas that we talked about in the first webinar. So with regards to social and B2B and the objective of this webinar, the goals of this webinar really are to focus on measurement best practice, online and offline social sharing. So how do we connect these online digital behaviors with offline actions? And Steve and Virginia are both going to talk quite extensively about this. And measurement methodology. So we're all kind of seeking that holy grail of what are the right KPIs, what are the tools and tactics that are really going to help form the backbone of a successful social strategy or social campaign. Some of the areas that we'll be looking to cover off today will be the key principles of measuring advocacy and buzz, measuring offline and online buzz and engagement, integrating measurement into a communication strategy, and then certainly the open Q&A that I mentioned earlier, which will be happening towards the end of the hour. So, a little bit of context I think is always useful. We are social animals, and we did spend quite a lot of time sort of discussing this in the first webinar a few weeks ago. And fundamentally, technology has created such a connected world for all of us. And we are now, and certainly I think Keller would have built their sort of methodology and business on this, seeking the opinions and advice of others. So it is more important now than it's ever been before to get credible recommendations, whether it's from your friends or your families, colleagues, peers, and experts. And the proliferation of the internet has actually just made those recommendations all that more important at a sort of speed and scale that we've never seen before. We also want to share our experiences. So we know that, obviously an enormous explosion of social media channels, anything from, Instagram all the way to Pinterest, YouTube, Reddit, you name it. So all of these are about shared experiences. It's not just about the content that's available on these channels. And it's really about, driving those connections and the engagements that we have with each other. And the proven impact of advocacy and buzz in B2C, but certainly in B2B as well. We always, I think people who work in finance and certainly in B2B tend to disconnect and separate that from, what we would say is happening in B2C, but now more than ever before, these things are connected, and it's almost becoming B2P, which is business to person. And I think certainly from a social media perspective, that's been happening much more, and I think the experts are going to kind of touch upon that as well today. So there's a lot of evidence as well that B2B decisions are increasingly being influenced by social factors, and I think we all recognize much of the Forrester and Google research which has come out in the past saying 2/3 of the buying and decision-making journey is actually happening online, and the research is happening well before people are picking up the phone, having those face-to-face interactions. And that's not to say that those interactions aren't important. We certainly know that they are. That's the last 30%, which is about the deal closing and the decisions actually being made. But so much of the research is happening up front. And I think, this is really important to understand, how social media fits into that buyer's journey. So the growth of the social media and these platforms is how people are connecting. It's also how we're seeing people collaborate and get information that helps them with complex decision making. And certainly we're seeing we are in a global environment. Things are ever changing and becoming even more interconnected. So things such as globalization and even greater connections are becoming more important. And I think, certainly within finance, we can all attest to the requirements of diligence, thoroughness, and dare I say it, even compliance at times are going to be really, really important in how we, make these decisions, but also the information that we get that helps us make these decisions. So, I think not to sort of belabor the point, but it is becoming such an important part of how professionals are making their decisions. So it's not a separation that only consumers are doing this, and social media is something that's just trendy and popular, but is actually really influencing how people are gathering information and making their decisions. So I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to talk us through the key principles of measuring advocacy and buzz.
Thank you, Viv, and good afternoon here from London. Before we get into the specifics and detail of how we measure buzz and advocacy and the tools we might use, I'd start first with a couple of key principles that I think really should underpin everything that we're trying to do in terms of measurement. Now, if you were on our first webinar, hopefully you will have got the message loud and clear that we really should be trying to activate positive recommendation for our company, our brand, through any kind of channel. Yes, social media and digital channels have a tremendous kind of reach and impact at the moment, but we know that a lot of conversation and a lot of influence about brand and companies is still happening in, if you like, traditional word-of-mouth channels, on the phone, face-to-face, networking at events, and so on. So we've got to consider that the offline piece is possibly the bigger aspect of consumer and business influence. And also that offline piece is quite different. It's got broader participation, tends to be less polarized. People aren't there to try and score points against a company. And crucially, in a B2B context, it's private. And there are going to be a lot of things that people are willing to share about a particular business that they've used privately that are not willing to go on record in social media about. And that's particularly true, of course, if we're talking about internal networking and recommendation within a say, a global corporation. Now, the second key principle is that we are really trying to drive behavior here, and that is to get our customers, potential customers, to say good things about us, to recommend our services and our products to other people. So ideally, what we're trying to measure then is actual advocacy and buzz and conversation, not a willingness to recommend, which if you're organization uses the NPS measure, that's what you're measuring. Would you be willing to recommend to somebody else, but not are you actually doing it? And there's a big difference between the willingness and the actual behavior. Some people are just simply more active and visible in social and networking environments. They get out more, they're frequently in conferences, they're active in social media. Those people are willing, but they're also more able to do it. But also some people are sought out more for their advice and recommendations. Internally, of course, they're going to be experts who are known to just know their stuff, but also this can happen externally too. We've all got business contacts who we just happen to reach out to first and foremost for a bit of advice, a tip. Who should I go to? I'm fed up with so-and-so. But some of this is also within your own control. What are you doing to get people to prompt a recommendation? It's not just about providing great service or great products. It's also reminding people that you're there, that you've got something new or different to say, that you've got new products, you're doing something interesting within a certain category. Whatever it is, there are things that you can do to prompt that. And crucially, why do we care about this is that what you don't want to be is this brand with a great reputation, but it's largely silent. So the example I use is pickled onions. You ask me for a recommendation, I'll tell you every time that there is only one brand you should consider, the wonderful Garner's pickled onion. But the reality is nobody asks my opinion on pickled onions. It's just not a category that people talk about. So if I'm Garner's, I've got to do something to get people talking about me. So that's a basic principle. Now, what should we be measuring? And there, again, are some basic rules and good practice that you can follow regardless of the audience, regardless of the channel that you're trying to measure. So a key one, clearly, is the volume of advocacy or buzz. Are people talking about us at all? Are we on people's lips? When people come think for a brand to consider, to recommend, does our brand come to mind? And that's measurable. It's a very clear, measurable thing. Are people talking about us at all? But clearly, we want that not just to be. We don't just want people to be saying things. We want people to be saying good things. So the quality of that conversation or advocacy is another very key measure. And again, these things can be measured. So are people saying positive things about us? Is the sentiment positive? Are they just saying nice things, or are they actually recommending us? No, really, you should consider these people. I know they're expensive. I know they're not the cheapest, but really take a look. And those the volume and quality measures are the two most important. But ideally, we should try and understand a little more than that, and understand what's being said about us. Are they saying the kinds of things that are likely to shape somebody's decision in the future, or are these just kind of nice to have kind of attributes that are being shared? If we've got key communications goals, is our content itself being amplified in a very direct way, or at least indirectly, that the messages are being passed on? And who's talking about us? In a B2B world, ideally we're going to be talked about in the C-suite and not just amongst kind of junior influencers, although both can still have some impact. But what about influencers in terms of acknowledged experts or really big networkers? Are we visible and talked about by those people? And again, that can be measured. And lastly, let's just not look at what's happened in the past, but will key talkers, key influencers continue to recommend us in the future? So those are some of the key kinds of metrics that we might try and track. But we boil this down at Engagement Labs to a core framework which we think is appropriate regardless of channel and regardless of audience, based on four key kinds of pillars, should we say. So volume and share of buzz is one. Sentiment, or the quality of recommendation and conversation about us. Brand sharing, the extent to which our messages are being shared, or is instead the discussion on a more toxic kind of issue, if it's a brand, say, with some reputational challenges. And lastly, influence and targeting. Are we engaged by key influencers, key targets, rather than perhaps a lower level kind of discussion where decisions are to be made? So let's think now about offline word of mouth, which is on the Keller face side of our business is our particular expertise. So what do we mean by offline word of mouth? We hear generally most people think you're assuming in-person, face-to-face, or off telephone-based conversations, whether it's internal or external. And we know this has been around for centuries. It still happens very much in business circles when people meet, either formally, say at events or company meetings, or informally, could just be on the train or in a bar somewhere. But I think it's also important to think of offline, or at least out of the public gaze, if you like, that there's an awful lot of online conversation that's happening, but not necessarily visible in social media and other public places. And we know that an awful lot of conversation still takes place via email and text and other kind of internal communications. So when we're thinking about offline, we're really conceptually thinking about any kind of dialogue or sharing of information that's taking place outside of social media. Now, clearly, that's not in the public domain. So if we're to measure that, we need to do something a little different from just scraping the web and seeing what's going on. We'll need to either get customers and targets to talk to us directly, or perhaps more realistically and more reliably via surveys, customer feedback, and this kind of behaviour. Now, in the B2C world, we do a lot of work of this nature. We have a product called TalkTrack, which has continuous tracking of brand conversations in the UK. We ask people what they've talked about over the last day or so and collect all those key metrics. But for more specialized audiences, or where we want a bit more depth, we'll do bespoke surveys where you're either one-off or you'll track KPIs, where you've got a sample of people defined much more closely around your business target and objectives. And obviously this is going to be much more appropriate for B2B as well, but still the same kind of things that you'll be measuring. Who have you talked about in the last day, in the last week, the last month? When you've talked about these people, who have you been talking to? Have you been saying good things? Have you been recommending them? And then obviously, as it's a survey, you can collect quite detailed information about their business profile. So this is the kind of thing we do in the B2C space. And in B2B, it's the same kind of principles, really. It is measurable. We're not saying it's easy. It's not necessarily something you can do on a continuous basis, but the same kind of principles apply. You can survey your customers, your potential customers, the market as a whole, understand who they're talking to, what kind of conversations they're having, are they recommended, and who really is the word of mouth champion in your category. Now, it's not really feasible to have very fancy kind of passive measurements, so it's going to be diaries and surveys. I would say that you can do that either as a separate survey, but it's also possible to add a kind of word-of-mouth module to an existing customer feedback survey, for example. You don't have to necessarily go out and do yet more surveys, but if you want to add a module focused around recommendation and advocacy, that can be feasible without breaking the bank. And the KPIs, very much in line with that framework that I showed you earlier. Yes, you want to look at the volume and share of conversation about your brand. You want to look at sentiment and recommendation. And in a survey, you can ask this directly. When you talked about my bank, what did you say? Was it positive? Was it negative? Was there a clear recommendation or a fairly weak one? And then you can get into the content of what was being discussed, what kind of topics. If we're trying to understand, perhaps relating that to outcomes, if somebody's heard a recommendation from somebody else. Well, what kind of content seems to really clinch that kind of move to the next phase that says, yeah, I'm definitely going to check these people out. So you can relate that back to content, and the targeting and the dynamics and the channels all come in as part of that kind of survey. It's all possible. It's not easy. No one ever says that measuring buzz in the offline world is easy, but it is possible. And you know, if anyone wants to talk about how and the practicalities, we'd be very happy to have that kind of conversation sometime in the future. But what I would say before we get onto the online side is that even if you can't measure this offline private conversation, you just feel it's impractical, particularly if we're talking about C-suite type of targets who aren't going to take part in surveys very easily. At the very least, ask this question: what are we missing? If what we can see in social media is all we can measure, that's sometimes the choice you have to make. But at least think, okay, if that's what they're saying in public, are we sure that this is what's being said behind closed doors in more informal conversations where people won't go on record? But if you can't measure offline, you've got some great online tools. I'm going to pass over now to my colleague, Virginia, who's going to talk about measuring buzz in social media.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we can start to explore B2B conversations in the online world. I think my colleague Steve has given you a really great overview of the Engagement Labs Keller Fay approach to measuring offline. We have a ton of experience and have been doing so for a very long time. I think in the online world there are some really great best practices, and I hope I can share some of those with you as well here. Excuse me. Let's see. Let's move on to the next slide. I think just as we've heard in the offline world, the metrics that we can actually start to monitor, engage in the online world are very much the same. I think that when you start to look at a community that you want to understand better and influence ultimately, there's a few things that you need to think about. The first thing that you need to think about is what channels, which digital channels are they most likely to be participating in? Some communities have private communities. For example, I was talking to a couple of office supply retailers and some e-commerce advertisers, and they actually have membership roles, and they create community and create discussion in a very private environment behind a firewall. So we need to understand that there is a conversation that may not be available publicly. Sometimes there is the thoughts around traditional media versus blogs and forums. We have found a very different conversation in each of those channels, and I think that before you get to measuring anything, you need to understand where are you most likely to find that conversation, and make sure that you do due diligence in trying to get as deep as you can with the tools that you have available to you, or just a better understanding of what that channel looks like and is all about. When you're thinking about going forward, you also need to consider what you're going to be missing. Again, a lot of it is around the public versus the private conversations. And I think one of the key important things is to understand what the experts are saying. The experts are often very, very vocal socially, especially in channels like LinkedIn and other public forums, or groups that are catering to an association in any given industry. So it's really important to understand who the experts are and how broad their follower network is. I think you can gain some great insights by understanding the expert first and then figuring out how to intercept that conversation. One of the things that's also really important to consider is how the influence flows. Is it different than a B2C perspective? We find that oftentimes advertising and media investment on media channels really generates offline conversation. Is it the same in the B2B world? And I think that there is some similarities, But I think the bigger question is, how different is it across the industry? So those are things that we need to pay attention to. In terms of advocacy, advocacy in the online world is just as important as it is in the offline world, and we really need to understand all the metrics available to be able to understand that. Measuring online, there are a couple of different types of tools that I think it's important to make note of and to understand what each of those types of tools give you. There are listening tools, which basically I call it your eavesdropping on conversations, which I love to do. There are scoring tools that basically measure owned conversations. So those are the channels that are owned by the brands that are trying to influence other folks. And there are also publishing tools which are often used to be able to control when you post information, when you start to publish, how you can optimize across channels. So those give you a lot of private information about your own brand performance, and those are important to keep in touch. Each one gives you a slightly different component. At Engagement Labs, we use all three of them depending on the task at hand, and we take a look and garner insights from all three types of tools to be able to give our clients a very 360 view. Some of the things that we're measuring with all of those tools, we can definitely monitor volume, but we also want to make sure it's not just about who has the most conversations, but who's being shared most, who's being talked about it positively. Steve mentioned that we are not just looking for recommendations, we're looking for positive recommendations and recommendations from people that have influence across their own networks. We want to understand the engagement of content. It's very important to understand what is working about the post and the comments and the conversation you begin, what is being shared. Why are some posts not being shared? Sometimes you can learn a lot from things that are not working and make sure that you avoid those in the future. So really understanding the content that is being shared is important because you can tweak, you can adjust. Maybe a content works fantastic in one channel but not so much on another. So you start to understand and adapt content to suit the best benefits of each of those channels. I think channel and content is very, very important. Oftentimes we find that people have exactly the same content and distribute it across different channels, expecting great results. Each channel has a purpose and a role, and audiences go to those channels with different expectations. So I think that you really need to adjust your strategy to reflect those expectations. Measuring online buzz also, it's a blend of qualitative and quantitative processes. From the quantitative side, use the tools that are available. We have a tool, proprietary tools, eListen and eValue, which measure both earned and owned conversations. We adjust the way that we go to market and measure depending on what the industry is, depending on the channels we expect to be active, and we sort of create a really big plan before we even do any monitoring at all. I often start to look at what we know about that industry first. What do we know about those influencers first before we approach setting up queries or defining universes and defining key metrics. I think it's really important to have a little bit of background before you get started so that you can have focused research. We live in a world of big data, and sometimes it can be overwhelming to start to sift through the relevant data. So any information and any history and experience that you can give yourself with the topic and the industry you're trying to research would be very important. And then the metrics that you search for are just as you would expect, share voice. I like to look at seasonality, and I like to trend volume over time because some industries are very seasonal, and if you're only measuring over 1 month or 2 months, you may be missing some of the nuances in some open space where you can actually identify new areas to grow. So really sift through it and identify. The beauty of it online is that you can measure long periods of time because the data is being gathered and collected. And we actually always have at least 12 months of analysis if possible. One of the examples that I wanted to share with you is we did some work with a brand that was trying to reach the small business environment. And there's no better way of understanding small business and their needs and a place to influence them than social, I believe. Small business owners, which are in Canada and in the U.S., represent about 80% of total businesses. So this is a huge market as well. It's a very fragmented market, but there are some common traits around SMEs. SMEs tend to have more control over decisions made across their companies, whether you're a single proprietor or a business that has 30 employees or 50 employees. They tend to be the final decision maker, so it's really important to understand the founders of those businesses. It's really important to understand what keeps them up at night so that you can create relevant content. And we were able to find so much information because they often turn to social media to share with others, to learn from others, and to network. So social media is a really important channel for a lot of people trying to reach small business owners. And we found that a blend of our listening tools, so the chart above monitors volume over time, and we start to see a lot of peaks, and we can explore those peaks to understand what's going on. And we actually found a lot of that conversation was driven by changes in government taxes and different taxation rules that would apply to them. So obviously knew that that was an important component to them that could galvanize the whole community to be very active at key periods of time. We also looked at a blend of e-value metrics, and on Twitter, one of the things that's really important for businesses is to be available. When your customers reach out to you on Twitter, a real-time forum, one of the things that you want to do is be there and respond within an appropriate time. So you can see the different trends of responsiveness throughout a period of time and how important it is to really be active and keep the conversation and dialogue going. In terms of advocacy, some of the metrics that we've seen here, and they're very much in line with the framework, they're in line with the way that we've been measuring total social, and the way that we've been measuring offline with our TalkTrack product, but we are looking at a quantitative and a qualitative approach to make sure that we understand what conversations we want to listen to. There's a lot of chatter online, so you really have to sift through for the relevant conversation. Again, you want to make sure that the sentiment is one of the key metrics that you're looking at. You want positive conversation, or you want to really understand the negative conversation so that you can change the theme. You can take power and control and change the theme. I think influencers and reaching the right audience is very important, and a lot of the targeting tools and many of the channels, especially around Facebook, can be very powerful to make sure you're reaching the right audience. I mentioned to you before how important it is to have the right content with the right target, with the right channel, and that you need to adjust that when you go across channels. One of the things I wanted to point out, and it's often one of the questions that I'm most asked, is around sentiment. There is a lot of automated tools out there that will monitor sentiment in a very standard way. We find that our best approach is to actually understand some of the nuances of each of the sectors and do some manual assessment of sentiment. Of course, now my cough starts. Excuse me. We have an approach that actually breaks sentiment into 7 different bands. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's very dry in my place. Sorry, Steve, can you take over for a second?
Sorry, Virginia, sorry to hear that. So, yes, I think particularly for more complex kinds of categories, we do feel that a more nuanced classification of sentiment beyond just positive versus negative is going to be more helpful and valuable for you. And I think particularly where possible, if it's possible to track a whole conversation online, that's often valuable, because if you're just looking at things one post at a time, you will sometimes get a bit of a misleading story, as you can see in this example here, that what starts out as potentially a kind of potentially negative kind of dialogue can be resolved either by the brand itself or by somebody else chipping in. So I think particularly in your more complex and specific kinds of categories that you operate in, I think it is definitely important to get up close and really adopt slightly more qualitative analysis to sentiment rather than just computer says positive, so that's okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's great to be part of a team that we can all support each other. Yes, I think that I just want to echo everything that Steve has said. It is very important to not depend exclusively on some of the standard ways that people are measuring sentiment, and to find the approach that best suits your industry. And sometimes taking sentiment from automated sentiment and then going through another process is really helpful. It may delay your measurement, but you may get at what you're trying to understand in a much better way. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, just sort of as a bit of a summary, is that in the B2B world, the C-suite is definitely a very complex target to measure, whether you're trying to measure them offline or whether you're trying to measure them online. There are some complexities that you need to address, and there's always there's always compromises that you have to take. There's nothing better than getting in front of someone and speaking and trying to find out what their opinion and their process is. But sometimes that may give you biased perspective. It's really hard to get people's times. They're busy. They don't want to participate. And in social conversations, sometimes the conversation may not be quite as authentic, at least in some of the surface channels. I have found the conversation to be quite authentic and very enlightening when you get into some of the deeper communities. In blogs and forums, sometimes people don't really identify themselves as who they are. They have different handles, and the conversation can be very, very meaningful, and I think it's really important to continue to dig further until you get it. Find that solution that takes you beyond the standard. I think I've been doing measurement for many, many years, and every target needs a slightly custom approach. Every target needs a slightly different methodology and a different way of trying to understand what their needs are. So I think that you need to go to that effort to try and assess how best to understand the target that you're looking for. And I do believe social can give you a great starting point. One of the other reasons is we're talking about measurement, not for the sake of measurement, but we're talking about measurement and the KPIs that we've chosen to focus on when we start to explore different categories is because they've been proven to have links to sales. We want to measure and understand what's working, what's not working. We want to be able to identify key ways to win because we can link this to total business success. There are many metrics that you can link each of volume, advocacy, sentiment, recommendation, engagement, and influencer. And there are metrics that you can monitor on a regular basis, as things like signing up to newsletters. Is your traffic increasing? If you have a digital business, and whether it's e-commerce or somewhere where you're trying to share content, are people clicking to it? Are they landing on it? Are they consuming all of that content? If you're using video, are they watching the entire video? Where do they start to drop off? There's so much data that you can start to use to define success. Follower growth is not something I highlight as the number one thing to measure, but it is important to have an audience. So you need to find the balance between having engagement and having just a great big audience that you're almost shouting out. You can take a look at your market share. Am I increasing sales? And even brand health can be affected by having a positive influencer strategy on a B2B world in the digital space. So I encourage you to start researching ways to do this. There's so many tools. There's so much data available. And hopefully this will guide you and give you a bit of a guideline, because it can be overwhelming when there is so much data available. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. This is Katie here, and I just want to take a moment now to step back from the kind of question of metrics that Steve and Virginia have been speaking on, and think about how measurement can fit within your overall communications planning, and more importantly, what value does measurement provide in the context of a communications strategy. I would imagine that most people in this webinar have been, or witnessed what I would call reactive communications at some point in their careers. And in these instances, measurement is often an afterthought. It's a nice to have. It might be a report that's put together at the last minute to justify a budget or to show some positive numbers to exec. But this really misses a huge measurement opportunity, which is actually to start with measurement to define the strategy, and then again to perfect the strategy. I call this the 1-2 punch, if you will. Starting with measurement ensures that campaigns are not just ideas-led, but also insights-led. Now, fortunately, as our abilities to measure online and offline improve, as you've seen on this webinar, so too has the interest in measurement advanced quite a bit. We see this every day in the briefs that we receive as an agency, that measurement and KPIs are built into the requirements from the start, which is really, really positive to see. And with all the tools and robust measurement methodologies now available, there really is no excuse not to incorporate a little bit of proactive research to shape the communication strategy from the start. Now, so where exactly does measurement fit in then into campaign development? Well, even if time and resource don't allow for an initial research or audit phase, it is essential to at least set measurement KPIs in the initial planning phase and align those with your objectives. If possible, this is followed by initial benchmarking and the establishment of regular intervals for measurement samples. And then in an ideal world, you can either run a pilot or some other test, and maybe for a week, a month, what have you, depending on the research that you're doing. And after which you can take a hard look at the metrics and take the time to dig out the insights and reevaluate the strategy. You can think, is the hypothesis correct? Do we need to shift the content, change the channel, or even in some instances completely change your KPIs? So regardless of where the measurement fits in with your processes, I would just say that it's really important to remember these two elements, so the 1-2 punch, and that measurement can be used proactively as well as reactively, and ideally both. So moving on from that proactive element and not overlooking the potential of this side of measurement, my next point would be around purpose. So measurement for the sake of measurement is certainly self-defeating. And looking at this list, you can see here on the left, we put together some of the top measurement and research objectives we often see from our clients. On the left, we have the request. So this is what we can do, what we can measure, what we can feed back. And on the right, the desired reaction, or rather the purpose. So why are we doing this? All too often, and we do see instances of this, but less and less, measurement and research is done in isolation and with little thought as to what can be done with the data or discoveries afterwards. So when thinking about the purpose of measurement, we would say that it is really important to be honest with yourself about what you can realistically do with the results. So take benchmarking, for example. We've already mentioned this is really non-negotiable as part of the process of campaign development. But don't create a report so dense with metrics that the numbers become meaningless. Instead, pick the most important ones that can be aligned with your broader business KPIs, and then monitor for the gradual shifts and sudden changes. When it comes to monitoring brand reputation, say, what good is this if you aren't actually pairing it with an alert system or an escalation process, which can identify and effectively respond to red flags? Another example, satisfaction measurement. Is this really worth your time if you aren't prepared to respond or adapt your services? Again, we hear this quite a lot. Well, we want to see what our customers are saying and what reviews they're providing. Is this worth your time and resource if you aren't prepared to change your behavior accordingly? The important point here is to really think of measurement not in isolation. Otherwise, you certainly can't leverage your learnings into effective change. Now, moving on to practice, so we can cover a few examples for you. How does this all work in the real world? As mentioned earlier, benchmarking doesn't need to be overly complicated, but it is an essential part of effective social strategies. One of our clients, a global financial technology provider, has implemented benchmarking quite effectively. About 4 years ago, the company incorporated social media into its communication strategy as an important channel for communicating with its vast community of stakeholders all around the world. So starting with Twitter and LinkedIn, they developed a content strategy, engagement strategy, and also policies for employees who were starting to use social for their own professional use. Why was their benchmarking particularly good? For one, it was built into the strategy from the start. So before they even tweeted their first tweet, they gave really careful consideration to how the team would benchmark progress, and also how they actually defined progress for them on social. After benchmarking for a year, they were able to draw connections between content and engagement. And once they had indicators of what normal versus unusual activity was, they were able to create an alert system for escalating situations as necessary. So not only was benchmarking effective for the comms team, but stepping back even further, it was also really helpful in selling in social to skeptical staff. So including benchmarking results, for example, into social media training later with different teams really helped teams across the company, regardless of whether they were involved in comms or not, really helped them recognize the value of the new initiative. Following upon some of the metrics mentioned by Steve and Virginia, I really wanted to share an example that connected offline and online a little bit when it comes to measurement. We were asked by a client to create a methodology for gathering feedback on a conference that they do. It's a massive financial services event that attracts thousands of delegates and exhibitors and speakers every year. So what we came back to them with was both qualitative and quantitative. Again, a strategy that was mentioned by both Virginia and Steve. Our strategy incorporated an adaptive online survey, but also qualitative interviews, and also on-site data capture. So that was in the form of badge scanning for attendance and iPads on site. We were able to assess satisfaction across various elements of the event, but also really importantly, we were able to identify key factors that were impacting the satisfaction and brand loyalty. A few things made this exercise particularly successful. Firstly, the anonymity provided by the independently run survey, which certainly earned far more honest and thus useful responses from the audience. Secondly, the client was happy to break down the potential silos for measurement. So really, in order to create clear, cohesive picture of the brand, they were really helpful in allowing access between the teams into the different metrics. So offline and online metrics were analyzed alongside each other. Digital and social teams worked really closely together to understand how the social was impacting, say, example, website activity and registration. And furthermore, connections were made between online conversations, a lot of things that Virginia just mentioned, and the real-world speaker sessions that were prompting those conversations. I'd say, though, really the greatest success of all this was the purpose behind the research, which was that the client followed through and put all these insights to work in planning their next event. So, of course, in turn, this will boost brand reputation because the stakeholders will see that their feedback actually impacted the brand and impacted the event and it was taken into consideration. Now, that was an example of purpose, whereas this one I would say is an example of being proactive. A few years ago, we worked with a large investment management firm to create a global social media strategy that would be effective across different regions and sales specializations. But before bringing together the stakeholders, the team invested the time into running full competitor audits of other IM firms across multiple channels and regions, and with the goal of developing benchmarks for industry best practice. Because this analysis was done up front and before any strategy or campaign ideas were solidified, the stakeholders were able to see the social opportunity for the brand with fresh eyes. So indeed, on the day of the stakeholder workshop, many entered the room with assumptions that were disproved by the research. And out of that debate came a strategy, came a roadmap, and eventually even employee training and additional audits to help employees take on the strategy. My last example is one of advocate identification. So a market data provider had reached out to us fairly recently because they felt that they were missing a trick in their research, reaching their target audiences. They did have a very consistent pipeline of well-researched content, but they weren't really seeing engagement with it, and they definitely weren't seeing the impact on their sales. So what we did for them was we developed an online listening program. Again, some of the different tools have been mentioned by Virginia already. And to do this, we looked at social media conversations to better understand who was saying what, when, where, and also around what topics, especially the topics that were relevant to this particular client. Through the analysis, we were able to identify holes in the content strategy, topics and tactics that have been overlooked, as well as existing and potential advocates for the brand. Again, this kind of harkens to things that Steve was saying earlier with the importance of advocates and how actually do you engage them and promote that further sharing. So these insights were eventually used to adapt the content and flesh out their database of influencers and prospects and actually develop an engagement strategy that would tie into their CRM system. So I'm going to wrap up with this picture of a very happy sheep, but actually my point here is really just that measurement can actually be a huge motivator internally for staff. I was at a conference recently where a payment startup was on stage on a panel, and they were kind of getting bombarded by questions around, how do you keep your customers happy, what differentiates you? And the fellow said that every single one of our employees knows our NPS score. And he just sort of let that sink in. And I don't know whether it's just NPS or what other metrics they use. We know there are lots of other metrics that you can use. But I think the significance of that is really that there is huge value in your employees knowing where you stand and having a single metric that they can look to and be inspired by and also feel that they can take some ownership in. Well, with that, I'm going to hand over to Viv to guide us on some questions.
Great. So first I want to thank all of our experts. I think we've covered really quite a lot of ground, from the conceptual side of measurement, methodologies, types of ways to measure, and KPIs that we should be looking at all the way through to some practical use case studies, which I think are particularly useful for the financial services sector because it is so sub-segmented in many ways, and I think we always feel like we're fighting our own battles alone, but actually, as you can see, a lot of these, a lot of our clients and a lot of what's happening, there's many common threads, and I think if the sooner you can get to grips with, benchmarking, some good, clear KPIs that you can tie back to your business, as well as, a sort of quite robust methodology, I think you're going to be starting to put really, really good best practice in place. So we've had a few questions come through, and we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm just going to, I think I might restrict it to two, if that's okay. We've got two really interesting ones which have popped through, which is, and the first I think I'm going to direct to Steve, which is how can we encourage silent but satisfied customers to more openly advocate and recommend us, which, as I think anyone in finance is going to say, this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have is, there's certainly satisfied and happy customers out there, but, how difficult is it to get them to advocate or even, testify on our behalf? So.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Viv. And obviously, we know that in some organisations, no matter what you do, they're simply not allowed to make any kind of public, on the record recommendation or even acknowledge that they're using a particular supplier or provider. But for the most part, there are things that you can do. I mean, definitely you need to understand within your customer base, for example, who are the ones who potentially could be advocates at the very least because they're allowed to advocate, we've got a healthy relationship with them, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be recommending us. But in terms of what's going to then trigger things beyond that, I mean, definitely, if you think about your starting point is why would somebody want to talk about us? It's not enough just that they're a satisfied customer and waiting to be asked for their opinion. What are we doing that's new or different or interesting? Are we making sure our content is reaching these people? and that it's contained within that something that's worth sharing and hitting people at the right time. And are we using the right channels to facilitate that? And I don't just mean, again, online channels where, sharing is at a nice click, but, something where we've got some very piece content that's of real substance, perhaps, that we've created, where we think, I think my colleague or somebody in another business could really use this information. I'm going to share it.
Great. Another question that's equally interesting is, and I think I might bounce this to Virginia, is can you sum up a complex conversation or recommendation in simple terms such as positive or negative? And I know that we sort of got caught slightly off guard when you were having a bit of coughing fit, but I think you were in the midst of really you were in the midst of definitely outlining, the sort of nuances of positive and negative sentiment. So I think it'd be great to kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think before, no, you can't just use a positive or negative without thinking about what is positive and what is negative. All of the sentiment analysis, the standard sentiment analysis, are based on positive words like love, agreed. It's really interesting. I think the first thing everyone should do is take a look at the tools they're using, and they often have the definitions of what words they classify to determine positive and negative discussions. Some of the negative discussions are rarely a nuance. A lot of them are gray. For example, I had a client who had a problem, and their PR agency was trying to be really helpful and change the conversation. Unfortunately, and he was saying something about, don't worry about that, worry about this. And he used the word mess. And we didn't understand why there was such negative, that you could measure it immediately, like live, and we could see that all the conversation was being classified as negative. And we found out that the word mess, which could be ambivalent, was being classified as a negative word. I think that's why I recommend that everybody take a look and take the extra effort to define what you think is positive in relation to the discussion you're trying to monitor. One of my colleagues always talks about the example of the word small. Small in the context of a mobile device is a fantastic positive word, but if you're looking for a car, you may not think that small. A small car may be seen as negative. So you have to put layers that are relevant to your own industry. A lot of sentiment gets classified as neutral because there aren't, positive and negative words. Neutral could be, if I go somewhere in relation to a store or financial services, I use this service, I go to this location. To me, those are implying behavior that is positive and almost an endorsement. And I would not classify them as neutral. I would classify them as positive. So I think the best advice I can tell you is before you get started, think about some of the words that are being used, some of the discussions that are being used to talk about the brands you're exploring, and decide before you even start to measure what you think is positive in relation to that topic.
That's a great answer. And, on that note, I want to thank everybody for making the time to join us today, and especially our panelists, so Steve, Virginia, and Katie, for putting all the effort into sharing their expertise and knowledge with us today. We will also be sending a follow-up email, which will have a recording of this webinar as well as the accompanying slides. So hopefully that will be something that people will find useful as well. So if there's any further questions, of course, feel free to reach out via email as well. Very happy to answer any more questions or any inquiries people might have about measurement or social listening, KPIs, etc. So on behalf of everyone at Cognito and Keller Engagement Labs, I'd like to really thank you for making the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.